Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Finding and Explaining Bread Mold on a Yak. My name is Allison Mullen, and I'm the Manager of Communications and Marketing at Essential Skills Ontario. Just before we get started and I introduce our presenter, I just want to give you a few instructions. At the right-hand side of your screen is your dashboard. There you can ask questions in the question pane. If it's a technical question, I'll try to answer it for you and assist you. If it's a question pertaining to the topic, feel free to ask at any time, and John will address them at the end of the webinar. And if you're on Twitter and you'd like to participate in the conversation, just use the hashtag ESOWeb. So now to introduce our presenter. John Stapleton worked for the Ontario government in the Ministry of Community and Social Services and his predecessors for 28 years in the areas of social assistance policy and operations. During his career, John was the Senior Policy Advisor to the Social Assistance Review Committee and the Minister's Advisory Group on New Legislation. His more recent government work concerned the implementation of the National Child Benefit. He is Commissioner with the Ontario Soldiers Aid Commission and is a volunteer with St. Christopher House and Wood Green Community Services of Toronto. John was Research Director for the Task Force on Modernizing Income Security for Working Age Adults in Toronto and was the co-chair of the working group associated with this project. He is undertaking an innovation fellowship with the Metcalf Foundation. He teaches public policy and is a member of the 25 and 5. So that's it for my intro, and now over to John.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Here is sort of a quirky presentation, and I've called it Understanding and Explaining Bread Mold on a Yak, which is quirky enough on its own, but it's also, I guess, at best, I would hope it would become a cult classic in the webinar circuit. In any event, it's an invitation to social policy innovation, and it's a fairly layered and somewhat repetitive discussion, but I find that when I've delivered it before that people sort of get bits of it at the start and then start to get more of it through the repetition. So if you're thinking at a certain point, then please wait till the end and we can get into some discussion, but I'm going to motor through it fairly quickly. So this first slide is a cartoon. And you can see a mastodon they've died out and says, that's all, my neck suddenly feels better, and it says it's early acupuncture. And part of the reason for the humor is that what we have here is something that worked, something, a particular action worked in a particular sort of way, but it didn't have a name and it didn't have a narrative. And that's often the case for what happens in the process of discovery, and I'm about to tell social policy advocates and activists that they should develop narratives for what they do. So, and I'm going to do that through the discovery of penicillin. And really, this first point is just to say the irony of the fact that penicillin was actually used in England before when the mainstream was using septic solutions, and what we had was the discovery of penicillin many, many times. But the way the scientific community looks at this is to say that, unfortunately, no one made the connection between the discovery of what people were doing that was actually healing people through antibiotics and penicillin, but no one made the connection between that and a medical discovery. Kind of an interesting way to look at it. So let me give you another example of something that was just not seen. And a good example of that is the Great Recession of 2008. And when Dick Cheney sat down for an interview with the Associated Press, he was asked why the administration had failed to foresee the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. And he said, well, nobody was smart enough to figure it out. Nobody saw it coming. You know, the mainstream conventional wisdom sees alternative thinking as sort of quaint gobbledygook or just doesn't hear it at all. And so it's often the case that these voices are out there and discoveries are out there, but they don't come to the mainstream. So Stiglitz, who is the same guy who wrote about the famous 1% that helped start out the Occupy movement, I'm just going to read this quickly. When the bubble breaks, everyone says, who could have predicted it? Said he was at a meeting at Davos, which of course just went on last week, because it goes on in January. And he had a couple of other colleagues explain how the bubble had developed. The chorus of central bankers in the front row chimed in. No one predicted it, the same claim we saw with Cheney. That claim was immediately challenged by the same small band that had been predicting the bubble for 7 years. But the bankers were in a sense right. No one with credibility in their circle challenged the prevailing view, but there was a tautology. That means a circular truth. No one challenging the prevailing view would be treated as credible, so they wouldn't let them in the club. And sharing similar views was part of being socially and intellectually acceptable. So even Stiglitz, as a Nobel laureate, and Nouriel Roubini were outsiders in terms of this club. So it doesn't. You can be famous and be very recognized and still not get into the conventional wisdom. And that's also what happened with penicillin. We'll see a little bit about that. So I'm going to talk about the nature of discovery, discovery to invention, invention to household name, making the connection, which is the most important part of all, a history lesson, a pertinent one, and the 6 keys. And when we get into the 6 keys, we'll have the most important slide in the deck, and I'll tell you which one that is. And then finally, discovery to invention and social policy and the importance of language. So the nature of discovery is that long before the modern, and this is an example, discovery of penicillin, indigenous societies used bread molds to treat infections. And application of bread molds on infected yak wounds was a common sight prior to what is considered the actual scientific discovery, which happened in 1929. And interestingly enough, Alexander Fleming himself, who was a member of the elite group of research scholars in England, which was the, and of course the UK was the center of the universe before the US, he often said that he did not discover penicillin. And people often think of that as quaint, self-effacing talk. But in many ways, Fleming had it right, and he probably knew that it had been discovered many times before. So sometimes solutions and discoveries are a world apart. In the case of penicillin, it was in use long before it had a name or a known inventor. But the discovery was attributed to Fleming, which reveals much about the rules of discovery. Modern discovery of penicillin, the 1929 discovery, illustrates that society refuses to recognize innovation and discovery until it's precisely articulated in mainstream language, part of an intelligible architecture with alternative solutions. And alternative solutions is very, very key in an optimum environment. Without those ingredients, discovery and innovation is often viewed as failure, as either failure or curiosity, and we'll see that as we go through the presentation. So discovery to invention. When presenting an idea to the world, we often risk rejection. We're often thinking to ourselves, how can government not know what I know? How can the leadership not know what I know and what the community knows and the self-evident truths that all sit around us, but government doesn't seem to get them? What makes us nervous when we go in to present to government? And we risk rejection because the idea seems imprecise, inarticulate in comparison to mainstream language, lacking apparent architecture, and without a substitute solution, and finally without an apparent optimum environment. And so that is often what really eludes us when we're trying to talk about social policy solutions in many instances. So the penicillin example is important for social policy, for all of the different disciplines of the people who will be following this webinar. When groups offer solutions that are not presented in the acceptable political format, those solutions often are seen to be are not understood or misunderstood or seen as quaint by policy developers and decision makers. And innovation and discovery in social policy will be seen with the same lens as that as mold on a yak. So you come in and you're talking to government, and you know you've got a good idea, you know that something's going to work, you know it's going to save money, you know that it's really going to move the yardsticks, but you're seen by those leaders as having an unintelligible solution with no connection to wider society. They sort of treat you as seeing mold on a yak and say, gee, isn't that sort of curious, that woman or man putting a piece of bread on the wound of a yak? That must be some crazy folklore. So it may not sound fair, but it's true that you're not heard until you put it into that intelligible narrative with a good reframe of whatever it is that you're talking about. So I say that it's the job of social policy analysts and community members to take community solutions that are seen with that same lens, as seen as sort of quaint, and convert those solutions into precise, intelligible solutions with appropriate architecture, with alternatives and substitute solutions, and talk about an optimum community environment in which those things would work. So let's take invention to a household name. It'll be easier for a social policy analyst to understand community solutions if they're put in the right language. And the scientific community won't allow any discovery to be recognized until it's established on its own terms, and social policy analysts that work in government and make decisions are similarly discriminating. So if you don't come to them with your idea fully articulated, it can't be half-baked, it should be fully baked, then that's the only way that you're going to make it into that mainstream, so that your ideas are part of the conventional wisdom as opposed to a conventional wisdom that you're constantly fighting against. And this is how social policy is like that mold on a yak. So what's the difference between the discovery of penicillin and bread mold on a yak? So here's our history lesson. Many ancient cultures, including the ancient Greeks, used molds and other plants to treat infection. Also records of Tibetans applying bread mold to yaks. But Fleming came back from a holiday, and he found an inhibition of bacterial growth around a contaminant blue-green mold on a culture. Ironically, this bread mold was actually seen as ruining the experiment because they were trying to look for certain other things, septic solutions, to the in the culture, and they actually the pesky mold in the agar dish was actually what they were looking for, but because they were in a previous paradigm, all they thought was happening was the experiment was failing. Very, very interesting, and that's often how things get seen. And certainly that group of economists who were trying to say that we're going to have this big crash, they just weren't listened to at all, and the solutions that they had were just entirely outside of the mainstream. So Fleming, who was a part of the club, grew a pure culture and called it penicillin notatum, and later called penicillin. And Fleming was well known and he had a reputation as a brilliant researcher. He had gone to all the right universities, had all the right degrees, but he was a careless lab technician. Often forgot cultures, and his lab was in chaos. So he came back after this long holiday and found that this culture were contaminated with a fungus, so he threw the dishes in disinfectant. He retrieved some of the unsubmerged dishes when he noticed the zone around the invading fungus where the bacteria wouldn't grow. So in other words, he was treating this as a failed experiment, when what he was doing was actually making one of the, probably the most important discovery of the 20th century. Very interesting. He proceeded to isolate an extract from the mold, identified it as being the penicillin, and named it penicillin. So scientific rules of evidence and grammar are strictly adhered to, even when previous discovery in another form is apparent. So we've known for thousands of years that these bread molds worked in curing infections in animals and even on people. But Fleming was a member of his own scientific community in the UK, and even the prevailing medical establishment did not accept that his findings had resulted in the cure that they had long sought. Very interesting. So here we have being the smartest person in the room for dummies. It shows you that even being very smart is not going to do it. And there were 6 keys to the scientific discovery of penicillin, and this resulted in the wide acceptance as a major breakthrough. And of course, it was in the 40s. It was considered to be the wonder drug. Imagine having a trash bin now that with big signs saying penicillin cures gonorrhea in 4 hours. That's how popular penicillin was back then. So what are the 6 keys? In this case, isolation and identification of the mold that restricted or killed the bacteria. Simple. Reliable reproduction of the mold. Very, very important. 3, successful creation of an optimum dosage. So they did that. Then they reproduced it in isolation from other harmful byproducts. Very, very important. Mass production of penicillin as a medicine, and that took a long time to do, especially during the Second World War. And successful development of substitute organic and synthetic therapies like erythromycin and other things for people who are allergic to penicillin. And one of my interests in this, I'll just say on a personal note, that I almost died from I was allergic to penicillin and had an overdose when I was age 2, and actually received last rites in the Anglican Church at the age of 2, spent a whole year recovering. So I got really interested in penicillin as a result. So let's look at the 6 keys in folk medicine. Well, number 1, they isolated the material to be used, the bread mold. Secondly, they found a way to reliably reproduce it, growing bread mold in other forms, and just allow them to go moldy. Developed an optimum dosage, fixing a predetermined mold on the infection. So they did that over years in trial and error in different cultures. They reduced exposure to harmful byproducts because they discovered that they soaked the mold in date wine so that it would just get the full effect of the mold. Mass produce it through manufacture of cheeses and breads, and then finally relentlessly experiment with various molds, methods, dosages, and coverage in order to gain maximum results. So the question becomes, what's the difference? Why do we not give a Nobel Prize to people in indigenous societies retrospectively for having discovered penicillin? So how is the scientific discovery, in other words, of penicillin different from the folk medicine discovery that mold could cure an infected gnat? Why are there no multiple Nobel winners? 6 important differences, and this slide number 27 is the most important slide in the deck, and if there's anything you take away with you, it should be these 6 important differences between the indigenous societies in the medical discovery and articulation. First is the precise written language of science was used. That's not true in terms of indigenous societies because they, in many cases, might not have been literate societies. So there's precise written language that people could read and re-articulate. Second, the availability of technology to isolate and mass produce successfully. So the indigenous brand of penicillin did not have those standards. Third, the availability of medical science for the purposes of a precise diagnosis and a regimen of care and recovery. So all of these things being articulated, being put into language, being put into manuals, being put into a structure of medical care. For the extension into other therapies resulting in alternatives, for example, the early discovery of erythromycin for people who were allergic to penicillin, and for the record, I am not allergic to erythromycin. 5, emergent alternative power elites. Very, very important. You don't have those same power elites in indigenous cultures. You have power elites, but it had nothing to do, or relatively little to do, with the treatment of wounded animals, for example. And finally, indigenous societies were not part of a discovery culture. They weren't trying. So in many ways, it was and this is something happened in the 1850s in the U.S. and in England, was the emergence of patents. So people would come along and then they would try to patent, articulate in a very precise way, and then put it into a patent, and then somebody could own it and reproduce it. So it became an item of property, and that's part of, again, the earlier one, number 5, emergent power elite. So the indigenous societies were not trying in that sense. So is it possible that our communities have real solutions that governments can't hear? So if we take the penicillin analogy and the Great Recession analog, and while you are sitting there and thinking to yourself, gee, I have this really great idea, or I've seen things really work in my community, and yet I can't get government, I can't get the mainstream to hear it. The answer is yes. Nice little community you folks have here. How'd you like to make sure nobody organizes it? Actually, I think that was from an Obama campaign. So is it possible that societies can persist in the wrong direction when the key to their prosperity is plain to see? The answer, again, of course, is yes. More community organizer cartoons. Good, careful writing and speech is important. So it's not, you can't just have the voices of a community articulated in the voice of the community. You got to take that voice and articulate it well. And power and money is important. I guess we all know that. There's much vested in the mainstream dominant paradigm, and if you're going to kick it off its block and come up with a new paradigm, you're going to have the power to overtake that existing paradigm that thinks a particular way. Control of the discourse, of course, lies with the privileged and not the poor. So if you have something to say about inequality, about community, about literacy, about numeracy, and how we should be promoting those particular goods, we have to do so in a way that will provide an alternative paradigm, and that has to be in good, well-articulated speech. And the intellectual capital is important in taking discovery to scale for widespread implementation. So if you got an idea, how do you go about scaling it? Steve Jobs with the Apple computer. That was one of the big geniuses there. It's not discovering the Apple II, it's making it, is being able to scale it and go worldwide. And asking yourself the question, are you really trying to connect, or are you just trying to use your own voice as you already have it and want your voice to be listened to? Generally speaking, your voice won't be listened to. You're going to have to develop a new voice to really connect. So like the penicillin analog, which illustrates how the right answer can be ignored until it's presented in conventional terms, and I guess I'm a bit of a conventional person, I'm saying, so too must propose social policy. It has to be presented in the conventional way. So you have to articulate it in the conventional speech of the mainstream and appropriate that speech in ways that are going to elicit a reaction from the public, a favorable reaction to the public, because basically what you want is your voice to finally become the conventional wisdom. So if you're to stop the next 100 people walking down Yonge Street and say, gee, what is the most important issue for our society today? And if you're a literacy advocate, you want people to say, well, the most important issue obviously is literacy. And if you were to get to that point, of course, then it would be the conventional wisdom. So poorly articulated ideas won't be heard. Their discoveries of solutions are often expressed in language that is analogous to folk medicine. The fact that we do want to hear the voices in our community, it's very important that those voices be brought forward, but they need to be articulated in a framework that is actually going to make those voices actually speak. People who have lived experience of poverty, lived experience of illiteracy, lived experience of lack of numeracy skills and other skills are often very, very expert in being able to articulate what has happened to them. They're not necessarily, and this may sound elitist, and I apologize in advance, but it may not be them who are best able to articulate the solutions to their own problems in a voice that is a mainstream voice that will be heard by government and the authorities that get actually in a position to be able to implement something. So when the discovery is first remade by government in the more articulate language of policy in a form that's amenable to the implementation of policy change, that positive change is often initially rejected as unworkable. How many times have anybody listening now, or anyone that you know of, has brought a good idea forward that later was seen as being a great idea, but when it was first brought forward, no matter how good an idea it was initially rejected as unworkable? That's almost always the case, because there is a dominant paradigm that part of the conventional wisdom, again, is that it sees alternative thinking as quaint gobbledygook, or just doesn't recognize it at all. And we certainly paid for that with the recession of 2008, when we had a lot of people who knew about it, but none of those people were being listened to. So community solutions are seen by policymakers, like anthropologists and doctors saw the placing of bread mold on a yak. So there they are with their dominant paradigm, their intellectual tradition, and they see it as something kind of, well, possibly interesting, quaint, superstitious, and the poorly articulated ideas of a low-income benefit recipient are often seen in the same way, for example, by government. They are not, they're seen somewhat in the same way as the anthropologists might have seen the mold on the yak, because here it was around for thousands and thousands of years. It was the solution. It was the solution for tuberculosis, and yet everybody ignored it. So will people actually die because our political, academic, and medical institutions will ignore discovery? You betcha. So it's very, very important that you keep at it in terms of saying, no, we have a solution. We need to bring that solution to the mainstream. Just don't assume that it will be heard, because the reality is that it won't be heard until you're able to articulate it in that voice of the mainstream. So it may be seen as the garbled prose of the low-income community member can seldom be re-articulated successfully in a form that translates into plausible policy change, despite the desire of improved societal participation. So you need the community voice in there. You need the voice of the person who is talking about their lived experience. But it needs to be framed in a way that is much more conventional, as opposed to just being done on its own. And I can tell you, I've been in many, many situations where I saw people say, we need to listen to community members, and we listen to community members, and then made the mistake of saying, well, what's your solution? And that solution is not necessarily articulated in the voice of the person, which is very valuable for diagnosis, but may not be as valuable in its current form to give us the solutions that we need. So it's important to translate for bureaucrats and politicians the social policy discoveries that work in low-income communities in the language of those who are in the position to implement change. For example, I'm just using this low-income communities as an example, but it could be in communities, low literacy, etc. And activists need to know that governments will not do the translating on their own. We often think as advocates, well, hey, that's government's job. No. They will only listen when it is placed before them in a language and in a framework where they can hear it. Remember, Cheney's economists absolutely did not hear. They did not know about. They were surprised by the fact that they had an economic disaster, even though there was a whole group of well-articulated ideas of other economists who simply weren't allowed into that mainstream. They're there now. Stiglitz is there now, and so is Rubini and Paul Krugman and other people like that who did have those voices. But it took that crisis to sort of crack it open and allow them to be part of that mainstream. So the importance of language is here. That's exactly what Fleming did in the late 20s when he discovered penicillin for the nth time. He told the scientific community in their own language. That's really the importance of Fleming, is that he was able to articulate it in the language of the elite and the language of the mainstream. No one before that had done that. So that's his real role, as opposed to the discovery per se. So the role of the policy researcher should be also is to articulate what has often been discovered many, many times before. Policy researchers who purport to articulate the views of community members need to change their goals and persevere with many inarticulate ideas for change. So the idea is you listen to what community members say, you listen to the language of the street, of the neighborhood, of the community, and then re-articulate it into the voice of government. There are very few people who are doing that translating job. But when you do that, then you find that you start having public policy success. So these ideas, like the discovery of penicillin, maybe that pesky mold in the agar dish, or the mold on the yak that is seen as unintelligible, kind of quaint, and if it's re-articulated as acceptable policy innovation, it can be done so if properly explained. Then reinterpreted in the grammar of the policy professional and ultimately the politician. I think one of the big takeaways is that government policy analysts, practitioners will not do that for you. If you're trying to bring something to government or get an idea into the mainstream, you have to do that work yourself in the final analysis, or you have to be in the position of somebody like Fleming, who is right there to do it. So they need to continue to re-articulate the seemingly rudimentary prose into policy recommendations, policy-ready recommendations, in a way that connects the complaint and the admonition with the policy, the palliative and cure, and ultimately the dream. And the dream, of course, is that your idea for advocacy or activism is one that then becomes mainstream and understood by everybody. Who's doing that well these days? Well, certainly the anti-smoking movement did it before and continues to do it. Mothers Against Drunk Driving figured out how to do that. The autism community has figured out how to do that. Often relentless advocates, often with many members who are mothers, because those are the mothers are relentless at this. So advocates can therefore no longer simply quote what is often seen as an inarticulate speech as authentic and moving. They may think it's authentic and moving. They must get on with the job of translating community ideas into publicly acceptable action, sound policy architecture that promotes the good of civil society. You've got to say what's in it for society, not just what's in it for the person that you're trying to serve. Mothers Against Drunk Driving did it for years. They talked about the pain of losing a child, and finally people just turned off. Then they changed their message and said, hey, that guy or gal out there who's drinking is driving in that missile. It may hit you. Well, that's newsflash. All of a sudden, is able to articulate it for the member of the public who's seeing that. The person in the mirror is relentlessly interesting to most of us. So the whole idea of, unfortunately, no one made the connection, I want to reframe that a bit. The last line of the opening quote recreates the standard lament of the policy advocate. But the question must be asked, between what? What is the connection that was not made between all these bread molds and scientific discovery? Is that they didn't have a guy like Fleming to come along and articulate it into the language of the mainstream. And that's what he means, I believe, when he says he did not discover penicillin. So clearly the discovery of the curative power of the mold on infection had been made many times before. The unfortunate lost connection is the connection between many chance discoveries of the fact of the cure and mainstream realization that the cure could be scientifically discovered and articulated, so it needed to be rediscovered. It wasn't discovered for the first time. It was put in language and rediscovered and articulated. So Fleming, by accident or design, by dint of his historical favor, the smile of history, he became the right man at the right time with the right language for the right connection to be made between folklore and science, and that is very much his contribution. So the role of the community social policy advocate, then, is to do the job of the reluctant Nobel winner, Fleming, and connect the truth of the community to the language of the mainstream community. And it's only in this way that the truth spoken by community members will become the obvious curatives and discovered as truths by civil society. So there we are. We got through this in 33 minutes. Pretty good for 46 slides. Any event, I guess we can now turn it over to questions and commentary.
Perfect. Yeah. Way to walk through those. So again, if you have any questions for John on the webinar, just ask it in the questions pane, and I'll make sure that he answers it. So a question here. So town hall meetings, focus groups, and other ways governments are collecting the thoughts of citizens are ineffective. Are they really trying to connect?
I believe that government is very much trying to, government goes through periods where they are trying to manage stakeholders. And I don't know, there was an American philosopher by the name of Ambrose Bierce who said, it was in 1911, so it's actually over 100 years ago, that he defined the verb consult as to obtain a favorable opinion on a course that's already been decided. And that's often how people will be cynical about government consultation. But when the government really wants to go out and understand through town halls and through consultations what people are actually saying, it is their attempt to go beyond the community and use their own policy people and their own spin doctors and articulators of various sorts and say, we are not getting this in the language that we need. The community is not giving this to their MPPs, to the media, and to others, so that we're going to have to go out and do it. And that should be a signal, in my mind, to people who are living, to community members who are trying to advocate and who are trying to articulate an idea to government, that they're not doing as good a job as they could be. So I think there are various times when, and you have to be a judge. Sometimes they've already decided what they're going to do, and they're going to go out and they're just going out to go through the motions. Certainly, I've seen that, but I think we're now heading into a time, at least in the Ontario government, with new leadership, where government is actually very much going to be listening. And so it's a great opportunity for those people who can learn the one or two big lessons in this paper and start to say, okay, I'm hearing what I hear in my community, but I'm going to articulate to government in language that they understand, their own language, what they need to hear. And they will do it effectively, and I think there's a real opportunity for that. But if that's not done, it means that the government will develop that on their own. Generally speaking, over the years, I would say that they have not necessarily been that good at going out and listening. So if somebody was trying to do medical discovery in the 1920s and trying to say, gee, we really have to do something about infections, would somebody have the listening and the seeing skills to be able to see a bread mold being applied to an animal and actually be able to say, you know, there might be something there? So those skills and being able to see what's going on in a community, to be able to hear it and to be able to articulate it in a language that the public understands is a very, very rare skill, and it's a skill that that we obviously really need. It's not something the government has that much. It could develop it, but generally speaking, the role, those articulators, like a Fleming, are very, very rare people.
So, John, following up with that, there's a few questions here about how do you learn to speak the policy language of the mainstream? You know, we're talking about maybe smaller community organizations who might not have that expertise. Are there courses? Are there people they can talk to?
I'd say a few things. One is learn how government works, and thankfully we have the web now, and there's various different, I mean, if you want to learn how the Ontario government works, there's 5 pillars of our Westminster form of government. We have Parliament, learn about how Parliament works, because that's where all 3 parties are. The government in power is the 2nd pillar. The 3rd is the public service. The 4th is agencies, boards, and commissions. And the 5th is crown corporations and foundations. Often people think of the government as the government in power. Like now it will be the Kathleen Wynne government. And the focus of the media and the focus of most people will be on that. But there's 4 other pillars of government where an awful lot of things are going on, and people need to, so go out of your way to learn about how government works. That's number 1. Number 2, learn how to look at who in the media is most effective in terms of being able to have their voice listened to. Who are the people who are who manage to get themselves on the provincial or national or even the city stage? How do they talk? What do they say? Look at their speeches and look at how they write and how they try to elicit support for what they say, and try to adopt or mimic those particular styles. In other words, are they short paragraphs? Do they say simple things? Do they build a case? that in a compelling sort of way? Do they use personal examples? All of those things are what, generally speaking, attracts people. And then finally, I would just say, in terms of learning those articulation skills of good English, invest in some of there's plain language speaking software. So, for example, that you can actually buy, or you can pay for somebody to administer it, where it will actually kick out those words that most people don't understand. You know, those when I look at proposals and see the word plutocracy in it 3 times, I start to really wonder whether somebody is really trying to say something to a more general public audience. Often try to, and I think really the overall dictum is not to ask yourself what do I want to say, which is what often people do when they sit down to write something, or they try to articulate something on a screen or on paper. They'll say, what is it that I really want to say? You should really answer a more important first question, which is, how will I be heard? And if you start to write with the idea of thinking of how what you're going to be saying is heard, as opposed to what it is I want to say, then you'll have much more of your mind on your audience. And having your mind on your audience and your various audiences out there is a much more important in terms of being able to turn your views into the conventional wisdom. And I'll just say one other thing, and I've said it before in this series about the conventional wisdom, and that is it has 4 elements, and that whatever you say, it should be simple, it should be comfortable, it should be in an understandable frame, and it should give the listener self-esteem, one of the most important aspects of it. What activists who seldom get very much beyond being a small group, they will often violate all elements of the conventional wisdom, because they'll say, instead of being simple, their issue is really complicated. Instead of being a comfortable message, they'll say the listener should feel uncomfortable. Thirdly, they'll say it's really difficult to understand. You'll have to really learn a lot in order to be able to listen to me. That's always a danger point. And fourth, instead of building self-esteem, they'll say, and when you hear my message, you should really feel badly. Well, all those types of things those 4 elements are breaking the rules of becoming the conventional wisdom. Yet when we think deep down what we want for any of our activism or our advocacy, we want it to become the conventional wisdom. We'd like to have in our dream that we could sort of stop people on the street, and their most important heartfelt issue to be solved by government and civil society would be your issue. But the only way to do that is to get it into the conventional wisdom and obey the rules for what the conventional wisdom is.
Okay. Following up with that, isn't there sometimes a danger that when you adopt the language and the dominant frame of thinking that you lose something along the way and start thinking in more conventional ways? Don't we also need to change the dominant frame or way of thinking?
It's very important that as you start to use the mainstream voice to articulate your view, that you're making the member of the public, that you have your eyes on the public, as opposed to either your eyes on yourself or of government. Governments are much less powerful than most people think. When you look at the Reader's Digest poll each year, it puts MPPs at the same level as telemarketers in terms of the respect the public has for them. They often have much more respect for doctors, lawyers, judges, and CEOs and people like that, as opposed to politicians. Yet the Yet the real problem is that the politicians in the final analysis is where people often aim their advocacy and activism. So as long as you have a well-articulated sense of your own goal, like, for example, obviously Mothers Against Drug Driving and this very, very effective group that has taken on the issue of autism, they have learned to have a particular advocacy where they want to get to, and they have set that out, and then they have set that out in baby steps so that they are able to slowly but carefully be able to win in terms of being able to get their message out. So I think in each case, what they have done is to think about their audience and to think about what the mainstream actually thinks, and then slowly change that idea. A lot of it has to do with just keeping your eye on the ball. But I'd reject the idea that if you use conventional language and you use language that people are going to understand, would mean that you would somehow lose your voice as part of that. What you're doing is really recreating your own voice as an effective voice by connecting with the public out there, and and allow the public to understand that your view is the view that they ought to hold. I mean, when we look back 50 years ago, drunk driving was really quite acceptable. People did it, and you sort of tried to get away with it. We had expressions like one for the road and one for the ditch and that sort of thing, and come on, why not have another? And those were all things that were considered to be self-esteem inducing. Well, then we took the Swedish idea that was developed in the 1950s of the designated driver, and then started to bring that into our conversation. And actually, at first, it was taken as something, well, somebody's going to be the designated driver. That's sort of the person in the room who doesn't like having a good time or is not going to be the life of the party. But slowly and surely it became an esteemed position, and somebody who says to the drunk or the designated driver, they'll just leave that person alone, and they're seen to have a very important role in terms of transportation back and forth for people who might have had too much. So those things take time over a period of years, but people who really have their eye on the ball and their eye on the prize will learn to articulate in the mainstream language that people are actually speaking and reach them in something that is simple, comfortable, understandable, and which gives them self-esteem. So now we're at the point where the designated driver actually is, it's a self-esteem inducing concept. As soon as that happens, you've won.
Okay. Often when we translate outcomes we are trying to advocate for, we get policy that falls into the be careful what you wish for category. We end up translating more than language. We translate the outcome into an ROI outcome that we cannot meet. How do we guard against this?
One of the most important aspects of public policy and doing public policy is the unintended consequence. When you work as a policy analyst in government, if you're writing a cabinet submission, one of the most important things that you can do in any submission is talk about, and that's eventually what government will do with any good idea. Like, you get government to actually write your idea up in a cabinet submission, you're really doing well. But in that cabinet submission, there'll always be option one. And option one is do nothing. And the do nothing or maintain status quo option is the most important of all within government, because it's mostly what they do. They have about government always has in a throne speech maybe 8 or 9 or 10 or 15 things that they say they're going to do, which means that they're not going to do all of those other things. But a good idea can come along, and in that first option, there'll be the do-nothing option, and there's always good pros. That is, it's pros versus cons for not doing anything. And the pro will be it doesn't cost any money, it doesn't disturb anybody, it lets sleeping dogs lie. The do-nothing option always has a lot to recommend it. But the con to doing nothing is that you is the whole idea that what are the consequences of inaction? And I think that the answer to the question that came in should be that as you are doing your own advocacy, you think about the consequences of inaction. I find that when people who are trying to advocate, or they're trying to, or they're an activist in a particular field, whether it's environment, whether it's poverty, whether it's literacy, whether it's food, or the arts, they seldom think about the consequences of inaction. And I think if you, and the other point that I'd make is that government seldom knows, like the community does, what the consequences of inaction are. So if you think those through, then you should be able to avoid the "be careful what you wish for" phenomenon that you just may get it, and you may get, because what you end up with is not what you wanted. You end up with something that you that you didn't want. And if you had thought through the consequences of inaction in the first instance, again, which people seldom do, then you'd be on top of it. I mean, somebody made the decision to build a subdivision on Indian burial lands near Bradford, Caledonia, and that wasn't a right decision. And it wasn't the right decision to build there because someone who was allowing that subdivision to be built did not think about, in the final analysis, what the consequences the consequences of that would be. So they just allow it to go ahead, and then it becomes a problematic situation. I should also say that Al Gore's become my hero now, because he did a movie called An Inconvenient Truth. It went on for 2 hours. All it was about was the consequences of inaction. 2 hours of the consequences of inaction, and he got an Academy Award and other awards for that. He might have got a Nobel for that too. So it proves that the consequences of inaction and doing it well can be very rewarding.
Okay, another question here. I've gotten requests from government to also do calculations for them, even though they have better access, sometimes only access to those numbers. Is it important to provide that information to them along with carefully articulated messages?
Yeah, whatever calculations you could do, they're going to be interested in your calculations. There's always a danger that if government's really trying not to do something, that they'll use a request such as that as a way of not doing, or maybe they're trying to teach you a lesson that what you're asking for costs a whole lot of money, and maybe when you see that, you'll temper your ask or something like that. It's hard to say in any individual instance what it is, but I'd go back to government when I'm being asked those sorts of calculations and ask that very question to them. Say, look, it's you that has the better numbers, and if that's true, are you willing to provide those numbers to us so that we can make those calculations for you? I think it's almost always a mistake to say something is the role of government. If your thought balloon is saying we're being asked to do something that really government ought to do, I'm fond of saying that if you hold your breath, you will turn blue. Because government won't do your advocacy for you. They won't work out If it's in the throne speech and it's in their articulation of what they're already going to do as a government, that's what they're going to do. They're not going to do anything else. And if you're asking them to do something else, then you have to have the fully baked version of what that is and have a good public explanation that's going to win over the public, because government is fairly, it's not inept at doing that. They're just not in a position. That's why cabinet ministers will often say, go out and lobby me. Take this issue to your community. And you're sitting there saying, well, that's your job. Well, actually, it's not. It's the job of the advocate to get out and do that, because governments are criticized for trying to tell people what it is they want and using their own money to advertise it to them. It's often the role of the advocate who can do that much, much more effectively than government can ever do. When government says they want to do a particular thing, there's often always a backlash against it that an advocate would not have that same sort of backlash.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question here. You may have sort of, I think, answered this, but what makes conventional wisdom conventional?
What makes conventional wisdom conventional is that's what everybody thinks. So, and conventional wisdom does change. What makes it conventional is that if you were to go out and take a poll on it, that you would have it score over 50% in terms of what people think. One very recent, or last few decades, that has changed is become conventional wisdom is the idea that we have global warming, and as opposed to global cooling. Because I can remember as a kid that we all believed that the Earth was getting colder, and I used to look out my back window and look for the glaciers to come. And whereas now we look at we have framed the world as a warming planet, but when we take evidence, we even take big snowfalls and cold waves as being evidence of global warming. So it's very interesting how we will frame our evidence and use that. So the conventional wisdom is the frame that most people look to, that a majority of people will look to something. And just to give you a perfect example where conventional wisdom changed because it first of all did not obey, or how something became conventional first because it did not obey the rules of conventional wisdom, and then later did obey the rules of conventional wisdom, is when Darwin first came out with Origin of Species. It was very much not the conventional wisdom. People believed in Adam and Eve, and we all evolved as humans right from scratch, and from the Garden of Eden, I guess, and the whole idea of ascending from the apes was considered to be absolutely preposterous. It wasn't simple. It certainly wasn't comfortable. It was very, very difficult for people to understand, given the religious frame of reference that they mostly had in their conventional wisdom at the time. And instead of giving you self-esteem, it did the exact opposite. It made a lot of people feel pretty badly. Until a guy named Herbert Spencer came along, and he reframed Darwin's natural selection theories into something called survival of the fittest. And just with that one phrase, he was able to, people were to say, well, survival of the fittest, hey, I'm fit. First of all, it's simple. It's a very comfortable thing because we're all here on the planet and we're all surviving, and other people who aren't are at the wayside. It's an understandable concept because the fit seem to do well. But more than anything else, it gave people self-esteem to think that they, not so much ascended from the ape, but that natural selection meant that survival of the fittest. And it immediately became conventional wisdom. Well, over a very short period of time, it became the conventional wisdom. And you can just see how much Darwin owes to Herbert Spencer for reframing his natural selection theory for it to become conventional wisdom.
Okay, great. Well, it's 2 o'clock, so thank you,
All right.
everyone for your questions and comments, and hopefully I got to most of them. And thank you, John.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. All right.